eventually you get absorbed in and you are Sonic.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to No Repeat, a podcast where we pick 3 songs with no repeats and no do-overs to create a perfect playlist for every occasion life throws at you. I'm Taylor Olmstead, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tyler Reed.
Are we having a Christmas party? Is this sort of... We're in the holidays now. I feel like I'm magically transported. Is this, the start of a Christmas party?
And Sean Evans.
Nope.
No? Okay.
Nope. No.
Okay.
Nope.
I don't think this is a Christmas party so much as it is, like, our version of Spotify Wrapped.
Non-denominational holiday festival.
Yeah, it's an end-of-the-year holiday festivus, if you will. If you're new-ish to the podcast, you may not know this, but at the end of each year, we do a series of kind of recap of the year episodes. We have our Song of the Year, which will be the last episode of the year coming out on New Year's Eve. We have Classic Favorites, which is this one. And this year we're introducing a new category for the third one, which is Artists You Need to Watch in the New Year. So expect all 3 of those episodes to come between now and the first day of 2023. But this episode here is Classic Favorites. And basically the idea here was we've been doing Song of the Year for a few years, but we wanted to start looking at songs that we came upon this year or we rediscovered this year that aren't new. So really anything not released in 2022 is fair game. And it's just kind of an excuse to look back at music we haven't gotten to talk about yet or hadn't gotten into when it first came out. So I guess the best way to open this up is to probably just talk about kind of our listening for the year. Everybody's Spotify Wrapped and Apple Music replays have come out. Were there any old vibes on there? Were there any classics that you rediscovered? Were there any albums that you went back to this year that maybe you hadn't listened to in a while? What was your historical listening like this year?
No.
Sean says only new music this year.
What do you mean, no?
Only like a lot of contemporary music this year.
Oh, okay.
Mine was too.
I feel like you haven't necessarily been choosing all newer songs this year. I feel like there's some classics. Huh.
Yeah, if you look at like the top 100, there are some classics, but not
a top 5.
Yeah, I mean, there may be like 10.
Yeah, I think you have to get into my top 100 before you start seeing anything that wasn't released in the last 2 years.
Well, I think that's sort of the nature of our business that we are currently in. I mean, the sort of like the spoiler for like everything is I didn't choose this album, but I should have, and whatever. But Mercurial World by Magdalena Bay was like just took all the charts for me on Spotify, and because I really did listen to that. I discovered and listened to that album this year, but it came out last year, so like I just barely missed it. That probably would have been close to getting my album of the year last year. So there was a lot of that. And then I really took kind of a dive back into, back into some like 60s, 70s, like folk stuff. And so that's kind of like peppered throughout the list, but it's not, sort of like the main things I was listening to. But, I feel like a lot of things that have kind of come out this year have sort of referenced those sort of eras of music. And so that's kind of why I sort of almost went back and was digging into it. So it's sort of like the past, the future's becoming the past and whatnot, blah, 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 whatever. So I think it's all connected.
For me this year, I feel like if I wasn't listening to new stuff, it was a lot of like, how do I want to say this? It's not like classics, but there are like 10, 15, 20-year-old things that like came out that in my more formative music years or that are like just like closing in on classic status that I really kind of took back out and dusted off this year. Like I remember spending one night cleaning my house and just listening to Room on Fire by The Strokes over and over because like I just love that record and I hadn't listened to it in a while. And so it was a lot of things like that where it wasn't necessarily like digging deep into the past like I have in years past, but kind of reappreciating stuff that, you know, I hadn't spent time with because I feel like the majority of my year was like I wanted to this year to keep up with every major new release.
And I feel like we collectively probably did not.
No, we didn't. And I think like it was also just kind of that year for a lot of people. Like Sean's talked about this before, that like a lot of artists held stuff in 2020 and 2021. And so now that we're getting tours again, you're starting to see high profile releases. You know, you had Beyonce and Taylor Swift and Kendrick and Drake, like a lot of big names dropping projects this year after hiatuses of some length. And it makes sense. Like now that you can tour again, you want to put your music out, but it does also mean that it kind of sucks all the air out of the room, because it felt like almost every week this year there was something that like, oh, I guess I should listen to this because the whole internet is listening to it.
Yeah. I don't know. I think just looking at different people, I mean, this happens every year. You look at someone's like top whatever. I'm like, oh, I don't know like any of this. But I feel like this year is kind of like it's gonna be a lot of Beyonce. You know, I feel like that's gonna be a lot of people's favorite. Sean, inaudibly shaking his head.
Not his favorite.
That's okay. But I feel like it's kind of like one of those years where it's kind of like, this is kind of the one that kind of did it. And I feel like, but it's also like, there's a lot of like really like high profile ones that I feel like lots of people are kind of like really into. And so I feel like the top lists are kind of like expected, but things that I'm not really gonna like listen to. Like it was funny because I think Pitchfork might have given the Weeknd's album like top 5, and I was like, that's fine. I completely forgot he even put an album out this year, but I mean, I believe it was good.
Yeah, and I mean, we can't really...
I feel like past years have been a little more exploratory.
And the weird thing is, like, there were also, like, retro trends this year. Like, Stranger Things made Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush a #1 song, like, 40 years after it came out.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious and wild, but Running Up That Hill is already on the playlist, so none of us could have picked it anyway.
Yeah.
But even there, it's like, I don't know, it felt real fad-based. Like, it was kind of like when that video came out, I think it was last year, of the guy longboarding to Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. And it's like, boy, you know, I would have loved to like talk about Fleetwood Mac on the podcast, but it's like, everybody's talking about Fleetwood Mac, but they're only talking about this one song.
Yeah.
And Christine McVie from Fleetwood Mac just died this past week. R.I.P. And, you know, it would be a great time to talk about that, but it's like, well, you know. So I don't know. I just didn't do the digging this year.
It's interesting that you went back to like sort of like the childhood era, because I feel like I've historically not really gone back to like sort of like maybe like my teens. And there's just not a lot of stuff that I'm like look back fondly. I'm like, man, I sure am hankering for some Fall Out Boy. Like maybe like stuff that was like happening on the lower end of the spectrum, like stuff that was kind of a little more outside of like my like vision, kind of in that era. But I don't know. I mean, I've said this multiple times that I just don't have a nostalgia for like a lot of those sounds yet.
I mean, I'm an inherently nostalgic person, but I think there's also like right now is the like 20th anniversary of a lot of really like pivotal early 2000s music. And so that's kind of where I was going, because I pretty closely follow the blog Stereo Gum, and they always do a post whenever a major album of like indie or alternative turns 10 or turns 20. And I mean, just going through a handful from the last 6 months, we've got The Roots, Phrenology, Missy Elliott, Under Construction, Mountain Goats, Tallahassee, Libertines Up the Bracket, Hot Hot Heats make up the breakdown. Beck's Sea Changes, The Strokes' Is This It? Like, those are all huge albums. And it's weird to think of them being 20 years old. Because, when you hear that, like, Play by Moby is 20, it's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Or, like, XO by Elliott Smith. Like, sure, but I don't know. Those early Strokes albums do not feel that long ago. And they just put out that documentary, Meet Me in the Bathroom, based on the book of the same name, which chronicles kind of the rise of the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and all those bands. And it's really interesting watching that and thinking like, oh, wow, this really was a completely different time. Like, there's a significant portion of the plot of this story that involves MTV. Like, Courtney Love plays a role. It's that long ago.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of it for me is like, now that we have a little more distance looking back on those things, but looking back on them in a different way. Sean, how did you come across your song? Because you said that you really haven't listened to a lot of old stuff this year.
I was sitting in front of my guitar amp one night, and I was just fiddling with the knobs of my pedals, and I got this tone that sounded very, very close to this song. And I remembered that I learned this song 5 or 6 years ago on electric guitar, and I started listening to this album because I was like, man, I really didn't give this album much of a listen to from start to finish. So I listened to this song a lot, learning how to play it again and kind of getting an understanding of what this band was about and what this album was about. So that's kind of how it ended up high on the list of songs I listened to this year.
Yeah, that's a good reason. It's good reason as any.
It's kind of a fun, like, almost muscle memory version of nostalgia.
Yeah.
Well, does anybody feel particularly strongly about going first?
I'll go first.
All right, Sean, tell us what you brought us.
For my classic favorites this year, I chose Possum Kingdom by the Toadies. I kind of alluded to earlier, I made this disgustingly awful guitar tone with my Earthquaker Devices plumes, which is basically like a rip-off of a Tube Screamer. And if that meant nothing to you, that's fine. If it did, you totally know what I'm talking about. And I was like, I should learn how to play this song again because it has a very gross amount of guitar tones on it that summed up the grossness of the 90s. And the guitar tones and how gross it was. That's just a good way to describe it. It sounds like I'm not using a technical term there, but I am. Just listen to most guitars from 90s grunge and you're like, was that phaser needed? Or did you who gave you that? That is an unnecessary tool. It's like bringing a bazooka to a painting class. It's just not necessary all the time. But in grunge it was. And I guess what I didn't realize about this song was, I mean, lyrically when you hear it, it's a pretty violent song and the music video is pretty violent. But there's a lot of mystique around this song.
Like bringing a bazooka to a painting class.
Yeah, kind of, exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of mystique, a lot of wonder.
And I was doing some research on it about how Possum Kingdom Lake is actually a place in Texas. It exists, but it's not really clear if there was a murder, if there wasn't. The lead singer of the Toadies was not candid about the meaning of the song for a long time, and then he kind of came out a couple years ago and said it was just based on another song. And I thought that was kind of interesting that there's so much interpretation of this song. But one thing that I do like about this song, musically speaking, is when you hear the verse, it's like it has a 5 count in it. So I don't really know how to describe that on a podcast. But like if you're playing it on guitar, the second time that you come around and play the riff, there's another beat there. And I feel like that always throws people off. Like if you ever try and play the song with the drummer, it's not counted in 4/4 the whole time. It has a weird time signature, and that just feels very uncommon for songs of the grunge era of the 90s. But it's like a cool little feature of the song that makes it fun to play, because it's not necessarily difficult, but it has a very uncomfortable feeling when you have to put that extra bit in. I thought that was a nice touch. So, with that, panel?
Yeah, man, I hadn't thought about this song in a while. The last refrain, the "Do You Wanna Die," was sampled on a DJ mix that I was listening to recently. And I was like, oh yeah, I remember this song from that line. And I kind of thought that was like the chorus, because I hadn't heard it in a while. And then I realized, upon listening to it, there really isn't a chorus. Like, there are repeated phrases, but it's really just kind of like one long verse. And like you said, there's like these weird bars of 5 in various points. And it's got the quiet loud of grunge, but not in the like structure you expect from grunge. Like, this is a really complex song from a genre that a lot of people malign as being just like sensitive cock rock, essentially. You know, and I think the other part of it that's really fascinating to me, and this is just kind of like where my headspace has been this year, is it's kind of a song about like a true crimey, like graphic murder of a woman, and it's sung from the killer's perspective, and it's from this era where like there were a lot of these stories that got played up in the media, and now we're like having this resurgence where we get all these documentaries that look back at those cases. Like, we're reliving the OJ thing, and Netflix just did a documentary about the Sally McNeil killing, and it's just like these kinds of stories like haunt us culturally. Like, true crime has been an obsession forever, but it's like something about this era of true crime and the way that like we keep wanting to like go back and relitigate these stories. And I feel like that's kind of what this song is in a way, to me at least. It's like, it's this cryptic song that's like about a murder, and it's like kind of grunge, but it's not quite grunge. And like, it's fun, but you don't feel like it should be fun, because it's about like dragging a woman into the lake. And like, I don't know, man. Like, this song is super, super cool, and I'm really glad you put it back on our radar. But it's, it feels like a good time to revisit it. I just, like, it's like a complicated fave, right?
Yeah.
Is it? Does it have to be? I don't know, man. I don't think.
I don't think it has to be. Like I said, I'm probably reading too much into it.
I'm sure these woke libs nowadays wouldn't let this song exist at all. But no. So I feel like Taylor. I'm like, yeah, this song existed at one point, and now I've heard it probably on WEBN, Wick the Frog, you know, whatever. But like,
Wick
I've
the
never
Frog.
like, I don't think I've ever like listened to it on purpose or listened to this album on purpose. So Sean, you've listened to this album on purpose?
Yeah, multiple occasions now. Yeah,
and it's good. The whole thing's good.
It's pretty decent.
Okay,
it's got the right rock and roll energy. It doesn't all sound like it doesn't all sound the samey. It's pretty decent.
Sure. I feel like it's interesting that Taylor said that. I feel like people think grunge is like really samey, but it's like, if you really like listen to those to the bands that were like sort of like the big hitters of the era, like they had similar like vocal affectations or like similar like sort of like pedals or whatever. but like the songs were usually pretty different, and I feel like it was like definitely a different era before like I feel like everything got really like commodified. I feel like we said things were like commodified, like really packaged into like a neat package, but I feel like, you know, maybe eventually towards like the end of that era it kind of got that way, but I don't really feel like I feel like all like what was it, Pearl Jam's one like wasn't that their first album? Like every song on that album is like pretty different and like pretty interesting. And so I mean obviously I'm talking about different artists here, but
no, I think you're making a good point, because it's like when a lot of people talk about grunge, they like want to make Nickelback jokes,
which is not. It's not.
Yeah, that's not the same thing. Or like Papa Roach, like not the same thing.
If anything, the artists that came after this, like the new, like the sort of like almost like new metal, sort of like the hard like butt rock we would call it, you know, like sort of like everything post this period, I feel like does become very packaged, very rinse repeat, and like you almost see that kind of like still even to this day, where it's like there are people who love these bands, they're still touring, you know, like and it like if you listen to an album you're like, this doesn't, you know, this is not doing a whole lot for me, you know, but like it has a fan base, and they're, you know, who's to stop these people from touring if they still are having like great albums, you know, or like albums that people are buying. So but yeah, I feel like it's definitely worth going back to this era and like really listening to these songs again. I feel like I'm definitely one of those people that was like, oh, grunge sucks, but like that's because I wasn't listening with my whole heart. With my whole heart. Because I mean this is cool. You know, the guitar tones are all sick. You know, it's like Sean said, he spent a lot of time calling this nasty, and it is nasty, but it's like, you know, like nasty, like cool.
In the best way.
But yeah, I mean, I think this song is cool. I mean, despite the connotation of the lyrics, and I kind of want to listen to the Toadies now. I kind of want to go back. I want to give it a little listen, because I think it's a really cool one. It's a really neat pick. Thanks, Sean.
Well, why don't I go next?
Okay.
This week I chose "Ego Trippin' at the Gates of Hell" by the Flaming Lips. Mentioned earlier that I was going back to some albums from the early 2000s. This is from Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And I have always just adored this record. I think it's perhaps the Flaming Lips' like most celebrated album. It's certainly got their biggest hits on it, I think. And it was like kind of the poppiest sound they ever had, which isn't saying much, but this is how I discovered them, because this stuff was fairly accessible. But I was discovering it like 10 years after it came out in like 2012. And now, 10 years on, having had even more distance from it, it feels still ahead of its time. This song in particular, like, you know, I could have picked the title track, or I could have picked Do You Realize, but I feel like those songs have become kind of like cliched. But when you get into the deep cuts of this album, like Ego Tripping, the palettes that they're playing with here, I feel like we are hearing now. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening here that you could hear on a bedroom pop record from the last 3 years. And I think that's kind of the cool thing about the Flaming Lips, is like a lot of times they push things and stuff comes out and it's like, ooh boy, the Flaming Lips are really on a weird one. But every once in a while they'll strike gold, and this album I feel like was one of those instances. I love the bizarro mix of like electric components with incredibly simple acoustic guitar patterns and like naive, heartfelt lyrics. it brings this warmth to what would otherwise be kind of a cold technological record, which, right after Y2K, right after 9/11, it makes a lot more sense. It's like, it's this kind of end of history era that culturally everyone felt like we were living in. And so you would make a record like this. A similar record, the Postal Service's Give Up, turns 20 next year. And I feel like there is this kind of like interesting anxiety in indie and alt rock at this time where like they're kind of pushing towards electronics while mainstream rock is going into like more guitar focused sounds and retro things like the Strokes and the Hives and the Vines. And these guys are over here like, well, we've already done that. So like, what's next? I don't know. Like, I find that really interesting. And I think the tension is clearly there in this record. And I don't feel like that question is resolved yet. I think a lot of the artistic questions around like organic instruments versus electric and like what is the future of guitar music, like we're still asking those questions today. And this album feels really relevant to that conversation. And this song's just really pretty. The vocal harmonies, I mean, come on.
What year did this album come out?
2002.
This electric flute sound, I recall hearing it from the Smashing Pumpkins album, but I can't remember which one it was. Maybe Eva Adore.
That sounds right.
I wonder what kind of synthesizer it was that made it, but it's like a pretty... I actually like the sound of it. I'm not super hot on the Flaming Lips. They're not my favorite band in the whole world, but I share with you that there's something here, and I think you're right that I listen, like a lot of the indie music that I'm listening to today sounds like this. It's weird listening to something that you love a lot and then hearing something that's 30 years old and it sounding very similar to that.
It's kind of trippy.
Yeah, but I feel like I've talked about that on the show before, that some of my favorite artists, when they're getting interviewed and they're like, who do you listen to? And they name off like 12 bands and I have no idea who any of them are.
It's a good day.
Or maybe I'll know like one or two. It's reminds me that everybody has interesting influences. I like the harmonies. I like that it's folk rocky, which I think when you hear a band name like the Flaming Lips too, you just think to yourself like, put on your seatbelt, kids. We're about to go for a ride. And it's not really like that. It does have some psychedelic things to it, but not in the way that I would expect it to have. So, good pick.
I don't feel like I'm able to appropriately appraise this song in like the day or so that I've had to listen to it, considering I've like flirted with the Flaming Lips for, like several times in my life, but I've never really sat down and really committed to them. Because I think the one album I really bought and then like lost or gave to someone was At War with the Mystics, and that was a much more energetic album, I would say. It has a lot more going, like a little bit more rock focus. Whereas,
yeah, it directly followed this record and was like the rock version of this sound.
Right. And so I feel like this is a very understated song. I feel like it doesn't really ask for a lot of your attention, but it invites you to it, you know. Because I feel like when I'm listening to it, I'm enjoying like all the sounds that I'm hearing, but there's not like a strong pull towards like it is much more of an easy listen. But I agree that I can hear lots of sounds that we're using now. Because let me. Is there like a simulated acoustic guitar, or is that like actual acoustic?
You know, I don't know exactly how it's recorded.
Sure.
I've seen, like, obviously live it was played with an acoustic guitar. I would guess that it's an electric acoustic with some kind of mute in the sound hole.
Mm-hmm.
So that you're just getting the pickups. You're not getting the resonance of like the cavity of the acoustic. Would you agree with that, Sean?
Yeah, maybe. They do make a pedal that simulates a sound. Can
There
make
you
your electric guitar sound like an acoustic. And maybe the upside of those effects is you get some really gnarly, fun sounds like this.
I'm also interested in the idea of this album coming out in sort of like a post 9/11 world and why it was created in that way. I think that's also something to really chew on and think about. And I don't know if I would be curious to know like what other albums came out around this time that feel like, well, everyone's going to respond to trauma differently. And so I guess maybe, because you said this whole album is kind of like this, right? In a way, it's a little bit more understated.
I mean, there are a couple of like hard rockin' tracks, but for the most part, it's like this.
Yeah.
Just a quick survey of alternative albums from that year. Previously mentioned Beck's Sea Change, Red Hot Chili Peppers By the Way, Foo Fighters One by One. Boxcar Racer, self-titled by Audioslave. Coldplay's A Rush of Blood to the Head, which is the one that has yellow on it. The first 30 Seconds to Mars record. Like, it's kind of a weird year, I would say. Like,
yeah,
mostly heavier stuff than this, though, with the exception of maybe like Beck.
Interesting. So it feels like this is a much more like almost like presumably between that and sort of like the name of the album and probably like, assuming the rest of the songs sort of like on this album, it probably feels more escapist. It's more about sort of like the escapist side of like the psychedelic stuff, whereas sometimes it feels like it feels a little more real, a little more grounded.
Yeah, I would say so.
But yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad that you picked it, and because I feel like I'm always trying to get into the Flaming Lips. So, and is it like, so if you, I feel like I always do this whenever I'm like, I'm intrigued by this artist that I haven't given enough time to. Is this in like the top 5 of albums you would listen to by them? If you had to give like a top 5 off the top.
I mean, not to turn this into a big long Flaming Lips podcast, but Flaming Lips I think of in like eras, largely based on who's in the band, because they had some pretty major like personnel changes. This is like the third incarnation of Flaming Lips.
Oh, okay.
And this is, if you like this sound, this album and the 2 albums directly before and after it. So the Soft Bulletin comes before and At War with the Mystics comes right after. All 3 of them kind of feel like a set in a way. Like you could build a box set of them and it would be like the Flaming Lips acoustic psychedelic years. But then directly before that is like the college rock psychedelia, like garagey sound. That's incarnation 2. The first incarnation is like hardcore punk psychedelic. It's like fast and loud and angry.
Yeah.
And then where we are now is like 4th era Flaming Lips, which is like really brash and loud and lots of feedback.
Uh-huh.
And they're kind of starting to circle back to this acoustic again, but I don't know, like they're one of those bands that like you find the stuff you like and you leave the stuff you don't.
All right. Well, I think there's a lot of subtle beauty in this song, and I feel like putting it on a vinyl, playing it, I feel like you could probably get a lot out of it. Yeah, I mean, so it's gonna be my vibe for that.
Well, speaking of vibes, Tyler, what vibe are you on this week?
This week I chose Crayon Angels by Judy Sill.
Nothing's happened, but I think it will soon. So I sit here waiting for God and a train to the astral plane.
So as I had sort of mentioned in my preamble, kind of was listening to a lot of sort of like contemporary sort of like folk, country, alternative, etc. And then sort of like through that kind of got into also like an older folk or sort of like sound like that. Because I think I was listening to Nick Drake, and I think that she was like a recommended suggested artist, or Spotify shuffled it into whatever. And so I'm pretty sure this is the first song I heard by her, and I feel like almost immediately I was captivated, especially by this song, because there's such a softness, such a gentleness to the voice. Her vocal performance is well, we'll just say everything feels incredible, feels very tight, feels nice, feels pleasant. But there's something so captivating about her voice. It feels so sweet, so gentle. It feels like a warm blanket. I really feel warmed by her voice. And there's also something about like a lot of her songs sort of have like a religious like twinge to them. She wasn't really religious, but she sort of liked to play with the idea of it. And so I feel like her sort of like symbolism and sort of like her sort of like mystical imagery, I think, is really fun. It gives you a lot of things you can kind of like latch onto. And I don't know, I feel like there's just enough kind of going on here. You know, I feel like she, like all pop music I really enjoy, is that it is a vocal forward piece, but the vocals are not always the main focus. There's other things kind of going on. Like there's this beautiful French horns kind of going on. You know, I feel like the acoustic guitar sometimes has a little like flourishes that really like take off, really have a nice like sort of like little emphasis at different parts. There's also just something about sort of like the way that she enunciates, just sort of like really breaks up like her vocal patterns. I feel like it feels like it's so sing-songy in a way, like, or she's sort of like really going to sing, and then it feels like it kind of almost like starts to like almost like a staccato. It kind of breaks it up, and it feels like there's just a lot of like interesting dynamics kind of going on in the song in general, just generally in her work. But so she has about 2 albums, unfortunately passed, making very little music, but I would say both the albums are incredible and very good. But yeah.
This is beautiful. I had never heard of her before, which is interesting because last year I spent a lot of time in this exact space, in this kind of late 60s, early 70s Laurel Canyon, California sound. And this album is like produced and partially financed by David Crosby and Graham Nash of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, because she was their opening act for a couple years before making this album. So like I was listening to tons of their stuff last year, just never found this. I don't know how that happened.
Wild.
But yeah, this is beautiful. I mean, gorgeous voice. Like you said, a nice restraint that feels very of the era. I think there's something really cool about like that kind of singer-songwriter performance. That's, you know, I love a good belting vocal, but sometimes the control is just as captivating. And yeah, the horn is a really interesting choice. You know, it feels very early 70s to just be like, you know, instead of just an acoustic ballad, what if we put some horn on this? Like, and it works. At least for me. I think it's great. I think it's a nice contrast to her voice. Yeah, I want to.
The funny anecdote from her live performance of this is she's like, "Oh yeah, I called up like one of my friends at like 3 a.m. I had a really good idea for this French horn part, and I would sing the part to him. And then surprisingly, he actually, he agreed to actually do it, despite me waking him up very very late at night."
That's awesome. I love that story. Yeah, I want to check this album out. This is super cool.
Complex feelings about this song.
Okay. Always ready for it.
I don't really like her voice that much. I think her pronunciation is not, like, the way that she enunciates words is off-putting to me. Which is like a really weird thing to say. I feel like it's like an odd critique, but it's hard to listen to anything else. It's like, I've been using the term icked a lot, but just the way that the song starts out with the pronunciation of crayon, it just icks me, and I just home in on it. It's a character flaw that I have. I like slower folk music. I think sometimes the contemplative folkness becomes a little too much to listen to sometimes for me. It's like listening to somebody who's super into poetry be even more into poetry, and it's not pleasant for me personally. I think sometimes there has to be something a little bit more raw. I don't know if this has it. It feels a little produced. Maybe it's the orchestral element of this too. Like, this is orchestral folk. But I like the guitar tone. I think that's nice. I don't know, man. I'm glad that you put it on here because it's really interesting. But I don't know if it's for me. And I've been into this genre for a while now. And I feel like I actually have turned a little bit this year. Like, you said that you have gone into folk in the past couple years, where I have gone into, like, classic country. So, like, you're into Judy Sill, and I have gone to...
like Tammy Wynette.
Like, yeah, and, like, Lynn Anderson. And people like that. And I'm like, wow, this is... It's like, really weird. Where now I feel like I need way more easy to digest music. Like, it's more pleasant for me to listen to than folk. Right now, I don't know. Maybe,
It's funny. I was
times are changing.
Yeah.
I feel like you really, really spilled your guts there, Sean. It's all right, buddy. It's okay.
I thought it was I think it's a good pick. I'm just like, what is it about it? So it's time for B-sides. Songs that were almost picked for interesting classics, but didn't quite make it. Anybody got some notable contenders?
I had two. This album's only 10 years old, but still does not feel it. No Future, No Past by Cloud Nothings. Hard to believe that record, Attack on Memory, is 10 years old. I remember seeing them the weekend that came out. It's wild. And then I rediscovered Troye Sivan this year, Australian YouTuber turned pop star turned actor. His song My off of his first solo record Bloom is just such a banger. Love it. He did some music for a movie he was in this year called 3 Months. All the songs he did for that are really good too, but just didn't feel classic enough.
Didn't feel classic enough. All right.
I mean, that record's like only 4 years old,
Yeah, similarly, Magdalena Bay, Mercurial World, just the whole album. Sorry, Ivan. That would have been probably what I would have chosen otherwise. Or probably something from Nick Drake. Just put whatever you want on there. That's kind of the area I kind of was in. Those are, at least that's what showed up on my top songs from 2022.
I've really been in a Glenn Campbell mood lately.
Okay.
I'm listening to the hell out of some Glenn Campbell. Like I said, I've been going down the classic country route. Maybe it's because you can go to like any record store and find just an enormous collection of classic country records for like dirt cheap.
Yeah.
They're prevalent and dirt cheap, and there's probably a song on that record that you know, which is just super surprising to me.
Oh yeah,
they're like that, and I think it's interesting too that so many of these performers, I'll call them performers, aren't really songwriters. I didn't really know that, and they basically just perform songs that were given to them by producers from camps and different stuff, which is so very much how music is made today a lot. And I just think there's some really interesting happenings between these two genres that are separated by 70 years in some respects. So that's what I'm listening to.
Well, Tyler, if people want to run it back with you, where can they do that?
Hey, everybody can find my design illustration work at rudepets.club. And as always, on the socials, Rude Pets Club on Instagram or Twitter.
Sean, if people want to dust off some classics with you, where can they do that?
Oh, yeah. If you want to dust off some classics or see some of my new photography exploits, check me out on Instagram at TallySean.
And if you want to dig out your old iPod and show me what songs were on it. You can find me on the socials at TC Olmstead. All of these songs will be on our official No Repeat podcast playlist, which you can find on both Apple Music and Spotify. It's got over a day's worth of music on it, so go check that out. And our beloved listener, Patreon supporter, Ivan, maintains a playlist on Spotify with all the B-sides that we just mentioned. You can find that by just searching No Repeat B-sides. We'll be back next week on the second of our 3 year-end episodes of No Repeat.
En als er al wie